if God intended to convey an important message through a historical miracle, wouldn't it just naturally have a touch of the mythical, right? Wouldn't it just all by itself just have some of that touch, some of that flavor to it, because it has these elements, right? There's angels, there's demons, there's visions, there's resurrections, right? There's multiplication of food, there's healings and all kinds of other things. There's water being turned to wine, and on and on and on. And so of course, naturally, it's going to have a touch of the mythical, but we don't want to make like an association fallacy and just be like, okay, well, I see this in other literature, therefore it just automatically is false. Now, you might say it automatically has a high standard that it needs to pass in order for me to rationally accept it because of all of these other myths. But you have to at least have a way to know that you're wrong. If God actually did something in the past, how are you going to know if you're wrong that he didn't, right? You have to allow for some sort of like criteria and examination in order to make that determination. Otherwise, you're being closed-minded at that point. So this is the most important part, but hang with the rest of the stream because we're going to talk about some examples here. The failure of these people who make this like, well, the Gospels are just derived from the Old Testament, or the Gospels are just derived from Greco-Roman mythology or pagan mythology. Okay. When people claim that the Gospels might be legends or must be legends even due to the similarities with pagan or Greek stories, they suggest the Gospels are more like fiction, but it's important to consider if some of these similarities would also be expected in historical accounts. If the Gospels are true history, it's natural to expect some common themes and tropes with other ancient tales, given the cultural and literary context of the time. Similarities can arise from shared storytelling conventions. Okay. So it's, again, the gospel authors, they're not writing as 2023 Associated Press reporters, right? They're going to have at least some, I'm not saying all, we need to be careful that we don't exaggerate this a little bit too much, but they probably are going to be using some of the shared storytelling conventions at the time, right? If the Gospels feature supernatural events, well, it's reasonable to expect similar elements in other tales and myths, right? It's also not surprising if God worked miracles in the Gospels designed specifically to resemble stories that people were already familiar with, okay? And so, for example, Jesus' feeding of the 5,000. People have compared that, and they're just saying, well, Elisha fed 100 men. He multiplied food, and he fed a bunch of people. Maybe the Gospel authors just kind of decided, you know what, let's make a cool story that Jesus is like Elisha, but even cooler, right? And so, well, maybe, just maybe, if this really did happen, people who were actually like witnesses to the event would make that connection and just be like, wow, like Jesus is a more profound prophet than Elisha. Who is he, right? Supernatural birth stories. People talk all the time about all these different supernatural birth stories of maybe Roman emperors, maybe other pagan parallel gods. Now, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, these parallels are really, really weak. Okay, and Christian apologists have really spent a lot of time like, no, these are terrible parallels. Okay, Danae in the shower of gold and Mary just saying, "Be it unto me according to thy word." Pretty different. Okay, and we could go that route. Sure, that's fine. But like, if Jesus, if he's trying to relate, if God is trying to relate a story to people, future Gentiles or Jews who are familiar with supernatural birth stories, like say Isaac or Samson or different things like that, they might be like, oh, wow, cool. Ascension narratives, right? We hear about that in pagan stories. Well, we also hear about that in Elijah, ascending into heaven, or Enoch being translated. Okay. Again, why can't God like repeat himself with his own messenger? Like eventually, like, what is he supposed to do? Right. We also are aware of significant events with rich symbolism, such as Jesus' crucifixion on Passover, right? But this evidence for the crucifixion is very compelling, right? Jesus was crucified. It happened on Passover. Most people agree with that. Most people don't really have a big problem with that. There's of course the idea Jesus is the Passover lamb. St. Paul even says so in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. But that doesn't mean that like Jesus wasn't really crucified, unless you're going full myther or something like that. And so again, if God is trying to appeal to a culture where divine births, stories, resurrections were a means of recognizing God, then it would make sense for God to perform those actions to demonstrate his divinity. Therefore, these similarities, now get this, this is the important part. These similarities are expected whether the gospels are true or whether they are legendary. Okay. And so you can't have a hypothesis that says, well, um, that the gospels are just copying all these pagan myths, all these pagan stories, or all these Old Testament stories, when that's the hypothesis that we're going to hang our hat on, and we know it because of these parallels. Well, my hypothesis, reported hypothesis, predicts basically the same thing. Okay, and so it's just like we make the same predictions, therefore big deal. So what? Like this isn't going to work. Okay, you're going to have to come up with other ways to argue against the gospels. If you want to use this, I guess, as like one tool in your arsenal, I suppose, but I think this is like very, very, very weak. When skeptics, when critics are making these points and saying, look, it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, therefore it's a duck. No, that's not going to work. Okay. More evidence is what we actually need that can't be easily explained by their historical nature. And collecting more examples of parallels. And so just making bigger and bigger and bigger list of all kinds of parallels from all kinds of other different literature, or gaining support from scholars in the field who think, oh, they use this literature, or they use this literature, they use the Old Testament, they used Homer, they used other Greco-Roman myths and this, that. That's only going to get you so far, okay? Good reasoning requires evidence that clearly favors one idea over the other. In this case, mere similarities aren't sufficient evidence. Okay. And so it's also, this is another thing, it's also entirely possible to find parallels from biblical, pagan, or other fictional literature in actual historical events if you look hard enough. You could find them all over the place, right? And so this fact alone does not invalidate the historical authenticity of the events described in the Gospels or other ancient texts. You've heard Harriet Tubman, right? She was a big part of the Underground Railroad that was helping get slaves, smuggling them to the north and helping them find freedom and different things like that. Well, a lot of times she was compared to Moses, right? People have made comparisons to Napoleon, to like Alexander the Great and different things like that. And people have compared Alexander the Great to like Achilles and different things like that. But those are historical figures. We can find parallels in all kinds of different things, right? It's just kind of the way the human mind works. We like patterns. We like parallels, okay? This one, I will give credit to Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy. In one of his videos, he brings out that there's a fictional novel called Futility by a guy by the name of Morgan Robertson. It was published in 1898. And it's really eerily, freaky, similar to the real life sinking of the Titanic in 1912. It features a fictional ocean liner named the SS Titan. Okay, Titan, Titanic, there you go. Both the Titan and the Titanic were described as unsinkable, the largest ships of their time. Both were around 800 feet long, had the capacity of around 3,000 passengers. Both the Titan and Titanic meet their fate by colliding with an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Titan sinks in April, just like the Titanic. The Titan's sinking date is April 15th, while the Titanic sank on April 15 to 16, depending on the time zone. In both stories, there were insufficient lifeboats for the numbers of passengers on board. And so, cue all the Titanic memes there. But anyway, yeah, a lot of similarities, right? Shortage of life jackets, right? There was a shortage of both. There's a high casualty rate. And so significant loss of life, speed and weather. Both ships were traveling at a high speed through icy waters and encountered the iceberg. Poor visibility due to fog was the factor in both disasters. Warnings ignored. The warnings about the presence of ice in the area were ignored by both ships' crews. And so obviously, yeah, Spartan's got the right idea here. And so all this tells me is that the Titanic is a myth, LOL. Exactly, right? These parallels, a clever mythicist, 2,000 years from now, or whatever, could look at this and go, clearly this is all made up. Clearly this is both are fiction. And this is historical fiction, right? Remember, that's the genre that Lewis says the Gospels are not, because the genre of this kind of fiction didn't exist until like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later. Okay. And so So yeah, we need to be careful about parallelomania. Hey guys, just tacking something on post-stream. One of the neat things about streams is that you often have ideas pop in your head afterwards, or your friends do, and they tell you about them. And this is something that was brought to my attention by Lydia McGrew, and it's that the mimesis people don't seem to realize that their rejection of the miraculous isn't at all helped by coming up with all of these parallels. What they're doing is they're just taking on extra unsupported commitments for no epistemological gain. What they would do to lighten their anti-miraculous ship would be to just wave their hands and say, hey, miracles aren't a thing, without trying to explain the details of the stories with these arbitrary theories about mimesis. It's not like all that baggage is going to somehow be a really great alternative to rejecting miracle stories. As an analogy, suppose an acquaintance of mine tells me that he was out driving and he witnessed an accident. And he goes into a ton of details, including the statement that a red and green car were involved. And later I come to believe that the story was a lie. Maybe I even get evidence seeming to indicate that this acquaintance of mine can't even drive. Well, my theory that he made up the story doesn't gain anything from my saying, I bet he put the red and green car in there to symbolize Christmas. It's just an unmotivated theoretical commitment that's weighing down my theory. Why not say that he put the red and green car to symbolize a forest fire? Green for the trees, red for the fire. It would make more sense for me to not try and give any particular reason for choosing those colors. And so skeptics really just aren't justified by rejecting supernaturalism by making up all these parallels and symbolic theories about where all this literature came from. If you want to say that the authors of the Gospels made up stories, or they got stories from somebody else who made them up, they'd do better just to stick with that.